The romanticized version of the American West, as portrayed in Hollywood movies, often depicts rugged cowboys in pristine denim, clean-shaven outlaws, and picturesque frontier towns. However, the reality of the 1870s was a stark contrast, defined by a level of filth and biological hardship that is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. Hygiene was not just a secondary concern, it was often entirely non-existent. The myth of cleanliness versus the stench of reality in the 1870s, the smell of a frontier town was overwhelming. Imagine a combination of unwashed human bodies, rotting animal carcasses, manure-filled streets, and stagnant water. Most people of that era believed that bathing was not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. There was a common medical myth that opening the pores of the skin with warm water would allow miasma or disease-carrying air to enter the body and cause death. Consequently, a person might go an entire winter without ever fully submerging themselves in water. Water itself was a precious commodity. In many arid regions of the West, fetching water required hauling heavy buckets from a distant creek or a communal well. Since the process was so labor-intensive, water was prioritized for drinking and cooking rather than personal grooming. If a family did decide to bathe, they would often use a single tub of water, with the father going first, followed by the mother, and then the children, all using the same increasingly murky and gray water. The infestation of living quarters' living conditions provided no respite from the grime. Whether living in a sod house, a log cabin, or a cramped boarding house, residents shared their space with a host of unwelcome guests. Bedbugs were an inescapable part of life. These insects lived within the straw mattresses or the wooden frames of beds, emerging at night to feast on the occupants. The transcript highlights that sleeping often meant enduring constant itching and painful bites. To combat bedbugs, people resorted to desperate measures, such as dousing their bed frames in kerosene or boiling water, but these were temporary fixes at best. The mattresses themselves were often stuffed with corn husks or hay, which became breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and even mice. The smell of these rotting organic materials inside the house added another layer to the pervasive stench of the frontier home. The challenge of laundry and clothing was another major source of unsanitary conditions. Most laborers and pioneers owned only 2 sets of clothes, one for work and one for Sunday best. Because washing clothes was a grueling, day-long task involving heavy iron pots, lye soap, which was harsh on the skin, and manual scrubbing on washboards, laundry was done very infrequently. Sweat, grime, and environmental dust would accumulate in the heavy wool or canvas fabrics for weeks or even months. This lack of clean clothing led to chronic skin infections and the constant presence of body lice, which were colloquially known as seam squirrels. Continuing from the general filth of personal hygiene, we must look at the external environment that dictated the health of a frontier settler. In the 1870s, the Wild West was not just a place of lawlessness, but a place of biological chaos. The crisis of waste management and sanitation, one of the most significant contributors to the unsanitary conditions of the era, was the complete lack of a sewage system. In modern times, we take for granted the invisible infrastructure that carries waste away. In the 1870s, waste was always visible and always present. Frontier towns were often built rapidly with no plan for drainage. The privy and the well, most homes used an outhouse or a pit latrine. The primary danger arose when these latrines were dug too close to the local water source or well. During heavy rains, the runoff from human waste would seep through the soil and contaminate the drinking water. This led to frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, which could wipe out entire families in a matter of days. The streets as sewers. In larger frontier settlements, the streets served as a dumping ground for everything. Animal carcasses, horses or oxen that died in harness, were often left to rot where they fell until they were hacked apart and moved. Combined with the manure from thousands of horses, the streets became a literal soup of bacteria. In the summer, this created a breeding ground for millions of flies. In the winter, the filth froze into a jagged, hazardous wasteland. The battle against dust and mud, the architecture of the West, added to the misery. Many pioneers lived in sod houses, houses made of earth and grass, because timber was scarce on the Great Plains. Living in dirt. A soddy was essentially a hole in the ground with walls made of dirt. Dirt would constantly fall from the ceiling into food, onto beds, and into the eyes of inhabitants. When it rained, the roof would leak muddy water for days, even after the rain had stopped. The dust menace. In drier regions, the wind was a constant enemy. Fine alkaline dust would permeate every crack in a cabin. This dust wasn't just annoying, it was a health hazard. It irritated the lungs, leading to what many called pioneer asthma or chronic respiratory infections. Women spent hours every day trying to sweep dust out, only for the wind to blow it back in minutes later. Pests, vermin, and the kitchen reality. The kitchen or cooking area was perhaps the most dangerous place in a Wild West home. Without refrigeration, food preservation was a constant struggle. The fly problem. Without window screens, which were not common until later in the century. Swarms of flies moved freely between the outdoor latrines and the indoor dinner table. They landed on meat, bread, and milk, transferring deadly bacteria with every touch. Food contamination. Meat was often heavily salted or smoked to prevent rot, but it frequently became infested with maggots. Settlers often had to scrape the bad parts off a piece of salt pork before cooking it. Milk was rarely pasteurized and often came from cows that might be suffering from milk sickness, caused by eating poisonous weeds or tuberculosis. Rodent infestations. Mice and rats were ubiquitous. They didn't just eat the grain supplies. They left droppings everywhere, further spreading diseases like hantavirus or leptospirosis. For a woman trying to run a household, the daily life was a relentless, losing battle against nature's smallest and deadliest invaders. The psychological toll of filth living in a constant state of grime had a profound psychological impact. The frontier grit, often spoken of, was a necessity because the alternative was despair. The inability to feel clean led to a hardening of the spirit. When you are constantly covered in a layer of sweat, dust, and the soot from kerosene lamps, the standards for human dignity begin to shift. This is why the occasional trip to a fancy hotel in a larger city like San Francisco or St. Louis was treated as a religious experience, simply because it offered a chance to see a white sheet or a porcelain basin. In this final segment regarding the sanitary struggles of the frontier, we shift our focus from the physical environment to the biological consequences. The rampant diseases, the primitive methods used to fight grime, and the devastating impact of these conditions on the most vulnerable members of society, women and children. The biological battlefield. Diseases of the frontier during the 1870s. The germ theory of disease was still in its infancy and had not yet reached the common settler. Most people lived under the delusion of the miasma theory, believing that diseases were caused by bad air or foul smells rather than microscopic pathogens. This misunderstanding led to behaviors that actually accelerated the spread of illness. Waterborne killers. Because outhouses were often located uphill from or adjacent to wells, the drinking water was frequently a cocktail of bacteria. Cholera was a terrifying reality. It could strike a healthy person in the morning and leave them dead from dehydration by sunset. The 1873 cholera epidemic ravaged towns along the Mississippi and pushed westward, claiming thousands of lives because people did not understand the need to boil their water. The consumption, tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the 19th century. The dusty, smoke-filled air of small sod houses and the lack of ventilation created a perfect environment for the bacteria to thrive. A person with consumption would slowly waste away, coughing up blood, while sharing a small, enclosed space with their entire family, ensuring the disease spread to everyone. Smallpox and measles. Without modern vaccinations, diseases we now consider minor were death sentences. Smallpox outbreaks could decimate a frontier town, leading to forced quarantines that often resulted in starvation for those trapped inside. Primitive cleaning. The harsh reality of 19th century chemistry. When settlers did attempt to clean, the tools at their disposal were often as damaging as the dirt itself. There were no gentle detergents or antibacterial sprays. Instead, people relied on caustic chemicals. Lye soap production. Most frontier families made their own soap using rendered animal fat, tallow, and lye, which was leached from wood ashes. This lye soap was incredibly harsh. While it was effective at stripping grease from pots or stains from heavy canvas, it was brutal on human skin. Using it for personal hygiene often led to chemical burns, rashes, and cracked skin, which in turn became entry points for infections. The agony of laundry. For women, wash day was the most dreaded day of the week. It involved hauling gallons of water, building a fire to boil it in a massive iron cauldron, and using a dolly or a washboard to manually scrub the heavy, dirt-encrusted wool clothes. The steam from these laundry pots, combined with the smell of boiling lye and dirty garments, created a toxic atmosphere inside the small cabins. Pest control. To deal with the rampant bedbug and lice infestations mentioned in Part 1, people used kerosene, turpentine, or even mercury-based ointments. Smearing kerosene on bed frames or even on children's heads to kill lice was common, posing a massive fire risk and causing long-term respiratory and skin issues. Maternal health and the mortality of the innocent, the most tragic consequence of these unsanitary conditions, was the impact on childbirth and infancy. The Wild West was a place where life was given and taken in equal measure under horrific conditions. Childbed fever, puerperal fever, because doctors and midwives often moved from one sick patient to a laboring mother without washing their hands or instruments. Thousands of women died shortly after childbirth from sepsis. The simple act of washing hands was not standard medical practice, making the home usually the filthiest place, the site of most births. Infant mortality rates. It is estimated that in some frontier regions, nearly 25% to 30% of children did not survive to their first birthday. Contaminated milk, often containing bovine tuberculosis, lack of nutrition, and summer complaint. A generic term for fatal infant diarrhea caused by bacteria-laden food were the primary culprits. The average life expectancy was pulled down to roughly 35 years, largely because so many people died in childhood. The Old West was not a place of cinematic beauty. It was a grueling test of human endurance against a microscopic and environmental enemy. The lack of hygiene wasn't a choice, but a result of a lack of resources, knowledge, and time. Survival required a tolerance for filth that would be unthinkable today.
The romanticized image of the American dream on the frontier often omits the brutal, soul-crushing physical labor that was required to survive. In the 1870s, the Wild West was an industrial and agricultural machine, fueled by human bone and muscle. Men and women worked until their bodies literally gave out, leading to a drastically shortened life expectancy that hovered around just 35 years. The industrial hell of frontier mining. Mining was the heartbeat of the West's economy, but for the individual miner, it was a descent into a subterranean nightmare. Whether they were searching for gold in the Black Hills or silver in the Comstock Lode, the conditions were inhumane. The 14-hour shift. A typical workday for a miner began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. Shifts of 12 to 14 hours were standard. There were no labor unions to protect them, no weekends, and very few holidays. The work involved swinging heavy pickaxes and sledgehammers in cramped, overheated tunnels. Heat and suffocation. As mines went deeper, the temperature rose significantly. In some silver mines, temperatures reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius. Miners worked stripped to the waist, drenched in sweat, breathing in air thick with rock dust and toxic fumes from blasting powder. The lack of ventilation meant that oxygen levels were often dangerously low, leading to frequent fainting and long-term lung damage. The constant threat of death. Death was a daily possibility. Shaft collapses, premature explosions, and falling down unmarked winzes, vertical shafts, were common. If a miner survived the physical accidents, they faced miner's consumption, silicosis, a slow, painful death caused by inhaling fine quartz dust that scarred the lungs until the victim could no longer breathe. Agrarian hardship, the myth of the independent farmer. For those who chose the plow over the pickaxe, life was no less grueling. The Homestead Act promised land, but it did not promise a living. To turn the thick, prehistoric sod of the Great Plains into farmable soil required a level of exertion that modern machinery has made us forget. The sodbusters. Before a single seed could be planted, the sod, a dense mat of grass roots, had to be broken. This required a heavy steel plow and teams of oxen. A farmer might walk 15 to 20 miles a day behind a plow, fighting the stubborn earth. The infinite to-do list. A farmer's work never ended. After plowing came planting, weeding by hand, and the constant battle against pests like grasshoppers. When the harvest finally arrived, it was a race against time and weather. Men, women, and children worked in the fields from 4 a.m. until they collapsed from exhaustion at night. Environmental brutality. The labor was compounded by the weather. In the summer, farmers worked under a relentless sun with no shade. In the winter, they had to tend to livestock in blizzards that could freeze a man solid in minutes. This constant physical stress aged people prematurely, making a 30-year-old man look like he was 50. Physical attrition and permanent disability. In the 1870s, there was no light duty. If you were injured, you didn't work, and if you didn't work, you didn't eat. The constant repetition of heavy lifting led to chronic back injuries, hernias, and joint destruction. Hernias, in particular, were a common occupational hazard for which there was no safe surgical fix. Men simply wore primitive leather trusses and continued to work through the agony. The toll on the heart. The sheer cardiovascular strain of 14-hour days of heavy lifting put an immense burden on the heart. Many men died of sudden heart failure in their late 30s, simply because their internal organs could no longer sustain the demands of their external environment. While the grueling work of miners and farmers is often documented, the frontier functioned on the exhaustion of every demographic. The concept of retirement or leisure was non-existent. For most, the only end to labor was the grave. The unseen exhaustion. Women's labor on the frontier. On the frontier, the division of labor was not work versus home, but rather outdoor labor versus indoor labor, and both were equally lethal. Women were expected to manage the household, which in the 1870s was a center of heavy industry. The endless cycle of production. A woman's day began long before the men's, usually around 4 a.m. She had to haul water, often weighing 40 pounds per bucket, from a well or creek, chop wood for the stove, and bake bread from scratch daily. There were no stores to buy pre-made goods. Everything from candles to soap to clothing was manufactured by hand within the home. Physical deformation. The repetitive nature of scrubbing laundry, churning butter, and carrying heavy iron pots led to permanent physical deformities. Many women suffered from chronic scoliosis, washerwoman's back, and severe arthritis by their late 20s. Childbirth as labor. Childbirth was perhaps the most physically demanding task. Women often worked in the fields until the moment of labor and were expected to be back on their feet within days. This lack of recovery time, combined with the physical depletion of multiple pregnancies, meant many women simply faded away from exhaustion and internal complications before the age of 30. The cattle industry, the cowboy's brutal reality. Contrary to the glamorous, singing cowboy of cinema, the life of a trail driver was one of extreme sleep deprivation and physical danger. The long drive, moving thousands of cattle from Texas to railheads in Kansas, meant spending 18 to 20 hours a day in the saddle. Cowboys faced constant vigilance fatigue. They had to be ready to spring into action at any moment to stop a stampede, which often happened at night in total darkness. The toll of the saddle. Years of riding resulted in bowed legs, chronic kidney issues from the constant jarring of the horse, and spinal compression. A cowboy's career was usually over by the time he was 25 or 30. His body was simply too broken to continue the work. Exposure and respiratory failure. Cowboys lived in the elements. Constant exposure to rain, hail, and the choking dust of the trail led to chronic bronchitis and pneumonia. Without antibiotics, a simple trail cough could turn into a fatal lung infection within a week. Physiological attrition. Why the body failed at 35. The statistic of a 35-year life expectancy was not just due to accidents, but due to biological burnout. Caloric deficit. The average laborer in the 1870s burned between 4,000 and 6,000 calories a day. However, as we will see in the next subtitle, their diet was often insufficient. The body began to eat itself, breaking down muscle tissue and bone density to keep the heart pumping. Chronic inflammation. Without rest or medical care, the body remained in a state of constant inflammation. This led to premature aging of the arteries and heart. In many ways, a 35-year-old in the 1870s possessed the biological markers of a 70-year-old in the modern world. Sleep deprivation. Both the miner and the farmer suffered from chronic lack of sleep. Sleep deprivation weakens the immune system, making settlers susceptible to minor viruses that their exhausted bodies could not fight off. The physical destruction of the human body in the 1870s was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of frontier life. It was an inevitability driven by a total lack of systemic protection and an environment that prioritized output over human life. The absence of safety and the disposable worker. In the modern era, we have strict regulations, like OSHA, to ensure that a workplace does not become a death trap. In the Wild West, such concepts were non-existent. Machinery hazards. As the West industrialized, primitive steam engines and threshing machines were introduced. These machines had no safety guards. It was common for a farmer to lose a hand in a harvester, or for a miner to be crushed by a malfunctioning steam hoist. A permanent injury was essentially a slow death sentence, as there was no social safety net or disability insurance. Toxic exposure. Beyond the dust, workers were exposed to deadly chemicals. In silver and gold processing, mercury and cyanide were used frequently. Workers handled these substances with bare hands and breathed in the vapors. Mercury poisoning led to the shakes, cognitive decline, and organ failure, further contributing to the short life of the industrial frontiersman. The high price of progress. The railroads, the backbone of Western expansion, were built on the bodies of thousands. Men died from heat stroke, premature dynamite explosions, and exhaustion. The pressure to meet deadlines meant that if a worker collapsed, he was often replaced within the hour, leaving the fallen man to recover or die on his own. The psychological toll of constant toil. The 35-year life expectancy was not just a physical limit, but a psychological one. The mental strain of living in a state of perpetual exhaustion and danger took a massive toll on the nervous system. Hypervigilance. Whether it was the fear of a mine collapse, a crop-destroying frost, or an animal attack, the frontier resident lived in a state of high cortisol. Chronic stress suppresses the immune system and damages the heart. The thousand-yard stare seen in many old photographs of pioneers was often a sign of neurasthenia, a 19th century term for complete nervous and physical exhaustion. Lack of leisure. There was no concept of a vacation. For many, the only break from labor was the Sabbath Sunday, and even then, farm animals still had to be fed and chores still had to be done. This lack of mental recovery meant that the brain and body never had the opportunity to repair the damage caused by the week's labor. The final breakdown. Why the body gave up. By the time a laborer reached their mid-30s, several biological factors converged to end their life. Organ failure, the combination of a high-salt diet to preserve meat, chronic dehydration from working in the sun, and the use of patent medicines, which often contained lead, alcohol, or opium, led to widespread kidney and liver failure. The old man's friend. Pneumonia was often called the old man's friend because it provided a relatively quick end to a life of suffering. However, on the frontier, old meant 38 or 40. An exhausted body with a weakened immune system could not fight off a simple chest cold, leading to a rapid decline. The cycle of poverty and labor. The more a person's health declined, the harder they had to work to make ends meet, which in turn accelerated their health decline. This death spiral ensured that few lived to see their grandchildren reach adulthood. The image of a cowboy sitting by a campfire enjoying a hearty steak is largely a fabrication of modern media. In the 1870s, the diet of those living in the Wild West was characterized by extreme monotony, a lack of essential nutrients, and a constant struggle against food spoilage. The result was not a population of robust adventurers, but a society plagued by chronic malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. The three pillars of the frontier diet: beans, biscuits, and coffee. For the average settler, laborer, or traveler, the daily menu rarely changed. Survival depended on shelf-stable foods that could withstand long journeys and primitive storage conditions. Beans, the musical fruit. Dried beans were the primary source of protein. They were lightweight, cheap, and wouldn't rot. However, they required hours of boiling, often in hard water containing high mineral content, which meant they remained tough and difficult to digest. Eating beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner led to chronic gastrointestinal distress for most of the population. Hardtack and biscuits. The biscuits mentioned in the transcript were not the fluffy versions we know today. They were often hardtack, a simple mixture of flour and water, baked until it was as hard as a brick. To eat it, one had to soak it in coffee or soup to avoid breaking a tooth. In humid conditions, these biscuits quickly became infested with weevils and maggots. Liquid energy, the role of coffee. Coffee was the lifeblood of the West, but it was often of the lowest quality. It was brewed so strong it was black as night and bitter as sin. Settlers used it as a stimulant to mask their extreme exhaustion. Because milk was rare and sugar was expensive, coffee was consumed black, contributing to stomach ulcers and severe dental staining. The scarcity of the fresh, the great green void. The most dangerous aspect of the frontier diet was the total absence of fresh produce for many months of the year. The geography of starvation. In the Great Plains or the high deserts of the Southwest, nothing green grew for half the year. Without modern transportation or refrigeration, a fresh apple or an orange was a luxury that many children might see only once a year, if ever. The failure of preservation. While some women canned vegetables, the science of canning in the 1870s was imperfect. If the seal wasn't perfect, the food would spoil, or worse, lead to botulism, a fatal form of food poisoning. Most settlers relied on dried fruits, which lost most of their vitamin C during the drying process. The salt pork problem. Since fresh meat spoiled within hours in the heat, almost all meat was preserved in salt. Salt pork or bacon was often just slabs of pure fat cured in barrels of brine. Consuming such high levels of sodium without adequate fresh water or potassium from vegetables led to rampant hypertension and kidney issues. The slow death of malnutrition. Malnutrition in the 1870s didn't always mean starvation in terms of calories. It meant hidden hunger, the body starving for micronutrients while being full of starch and fat. This led to a general weakening of the population, making them unable to recover from the backbreaking labor discussed in the previous section. The biological cost of a diet consisting only of beans, biscuits, and salted meat was immense. While these foods provided enough calories to keep a person moving, they lacked the vital micronutrients required to keep a body healthy. This led to specific, agonizing diseases that defined the frontier experience. The horror of scurvy, the Black Death of the plains. As mentioned in a video, the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables led to scurvy, a disease caused by a severe deficiency of vitamin C. In the 1870s, many settlers didn't realize that their winter sickness was actually their bodies literally falling apart at the cellular level. Physical disintegration. Vitamin C is essential for the production of collagen, the glue that holds the human body together. Without it, old wounds would mysteriously reopen and skin would bruise at the slightest touch. Dental decay and gum disease. One of the most terrifying symptoms of scurvy was the effect on the mouth. Gums would become swollen, black, and spongy. They would bleed uncontrollably, and eventually, the connective tissue holding the teeth in place would dissolve. Men and women in their 20s often lost all their teeth, not just from lack of brushing, but because their gums could no longer hold them. The lame sickness. Scurvy also caused internal bleeding in the joints. Settlers would find themselves unable to walk due to extreme pain in their knees and ankles, which was often misdiagnosed as rheumatism. This prevented them from performing the backbreaking labor required for survival, leading to a cycle of poverty and further starvation. The milk sickness and toxic livestock. Even when settlers had access to animal products like milk and beef, the food itself could be a carrier of death. The white snake root. In many parts of the Midwest and West, cows grazed on wild vegetation. If a cow ate the white snake root plant, the toxins would be concentrated in its milk and meat. Humans who consumed these products developed milk sickness. Symptoms and fatality. Victims suffered from severe vomiting, tremors, and a distinct odor of acetone on the breath. This was a mysterious and frequent killer. It is famously known for killing Abraham Lincoln's mother. It added an element of Russian roulette to the daily diet. Even the most natural food could be poisonous. Adulterated foods, the danger of the general store. For those living in frontier towns, the general store provided supplies, but these were often unregulated and dangerous. Filler and fraud. Flour was often stretched with plaster of Paris or chalk to increase its weight. Coffee was frequently cut with roasted acorns, sawdust, or even dirt. Toxic colorants. To make old, gray meat look fresh and red, some unscrupulous butchers used lead-based dyes or borax. Without any food safety laws, the very act of buying groceries could lead to chronic heavy metal poisoning. The vinegar cure. Because settlers craved the acidity they were missing from fruit, they consumed massive amounts of vinegar. While vinegar helped prevent some bacteria, the pickling of almost everything meant that the average person's stomach lining was in a state of constant irritation, leading to chronic ulcers. The impact on childhood development, the malnutrition of the 1870s, had a permanent impact on the physical stature of the population. Rickets, a lack of vitamin D. Despite the sun, many children were kept covered or lived in dark, sod houses, and calcium led to rickets, causing bowed legs and stunted growth. Cognitive effects. The lack of essential fatty acids found in fish or nuts, which were rare in the interior West, and B vitamins, meant that children often suffered from developmental delays and irritability, which was often mistaken for a sour temperament. The nutritional crisis of the 1870s was not a static condition, it fluctuated with the seasons. While the summer offered a slight reprieve through wild berries or small bardens, the winter was a period of systemic biological depletion. The starvation winters and emergency measures. On the frontier, winter was the ultimate judge of a family's preparation. If the harvest was poor or the supply wagon didn't arrive, the diet shifted from unhealthy to deadly. Eating the unthinkable. In extreme cases of isolation and snow-ins, settlers were forced to eat their livestock, animals they desperately needed for work the following spring. When the livestock ran out, stories of people eating boiled leather from boots or saddles or flour made from ground bark were not uncommon. The hunger moon. Late February and March were the deadliest months. By this time, the body's internal stores of vitamins, like vitamin C and D, were completely exhausted. This is when the symptoms of scurvy, mentioned in Part 2, would peak. The winter doldrums were often actually a state of physical clinical depression caused by severe malnutrition. The psychological monopoly of monotony. We often underestimate the mental toll of eating the exact same meal, beans, salt pork, and hardtack, for hundreds of days in a row. Food boredom as a disease. 19th century doctors noted a condition they called anorexia of the frontier, where people simply lost the will to eat because the food was so unappealing. This led to further weakness and a loss of morale. The craving for sweetness. Because the body was desperate for quick energy, settlers had an almost pathological craving for sugar. When white sugar was unavailable, they used molasses or sorghum. This high-sugar, high-starch diet, combined with a total lack of dental hygiene, meant that a smile in the Wild West was often a display of black, rotting stumps. The turning point. The refrigerated rail car and the end of the Salt Age. The 1870s was a decade of transition. Toward the end of this period, two major inventions began to change the way the West ate, though it took years for these to reach the average sodbuster. Gustavus Swift and the refrigerator car. In the late 1870s, the development of the refrigerated rail car meant that fresh meat could be slaughtered in Chicago and shipped west without being drowned in salt. This slowly reduced the rates of salt-induced hypertension. The rise of the tin can. While canning existed, the late 19th century saw the mass production of canned fruits and vegetables. For the first time, a miner in a desolate mountain camp could eat canned peaches, providing a massive burst of vitamin C and sugar that could literally save his life from scurvy. The arrival of standardized goods. As the railroads connected the coast to the interior, brands like Quaker Oats and Campbell's began to appear. These provided a more consistent, though still not perfect, level of nutrition compared to the adulterated, chalky flour of the local general store. The Wild West was a land of hunger. The physical descriptions we have of the people from that era, gaunt faces, sunken eyes, and short statures, were the direct result of a diet that was failing them. When the video notes the reliance on beans, biscuits, and coffee, it is describing a recipe for slow biological decay. The survival of those who made it through this era is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human body, which managed to build a civilization while running on the lowest quality fuel imaginable. The medical landscape of the 1870s Wild West was a theater of pain. In an era before the widespread use of antibiotics, sterile environments, or reliable anesthesia, the line between a doctor and a butcher was often terrifyingly thin. As noted in the video, even a minor scratch could escalate into a death sentence. The absence of anesthesia, surgery in full consciousness, Perhaps the most harrowing aspect of 19th century medicine was the lack of effective pain management. While ether and chloroform had been discovered, they were rarely available in remote frontier towns or mining camps. Biting the bullet. This famous phrase originated from the grim reality of patients having to clench their teeth on a piece of lead or leather to keep from screaming or biting their own tongues off during surgery. The speed of the surgeon. Because patients were fully awake and feeling every incision, the best surgeons were not the most careful ones, but the fastest. An amputation of a leg was often performed in under 2 minutes. The goal was to finish the procedure before the patient died of surgical shock, a state where the nervous system simply shut down due to unbearable pain. Physical restraint. Every operating table, which was often just a kitchen table or a flat board, was surrounded by strong men whose only job was to pin the patient down. The psychological trauma of being held down while a saw cut through bone left survivors with lifelong scars. The lethal ignorance of germ theory. In the 1870s, many frontier doctors still did not believe in, or had not heard of, Joseph Lister's work on antiseptics. The concept that invisible germs caused infection was treated as a radical and often ridiculous theory. The laudable pus myth. Many doctors actually believed that the appearance of pus in a wound was a sign of healing. In reality, it was a sign of a massive staph or strep infection that was likely to turn into sepsis, blood poisoning. Unwashed hands and tools. A doctor might move directly from performing an autopsy to delivering a baby, or from lancing a boil to stitching a deep gash, without washing his hands or his instruments. Surgical tools were often kept in velvet-lined cases that were breeding grounds for bacteria. The blackened silk. Stitches were often made with silk thread that the doctor kept in his pocket or held in his mouth while working. This introduced bacteria directly into the deepest parts of a wound, making infection almost a 100% certainty. The danger of minor injuries. In the modern world, we treat a small cut with an antiseptic wipe and a bandage. In the 1870s, that same cut was a potential gateway for two of the era's most feared killers: tetanus and gangrene. Tetanus, lockjaw. Since settlers worked closely with livestock and manure-rich soil, tetanus spores were everywhere. A puncture wound from a rusty nail or a splinter could lead to agonizing muscle spasms, starting in the jaw and eventually paralyzing the respiratory system. There was no cure. Gangrene. If a wound became infected and the blood supply was cut off, the flesh would begin to rot while the patient was still alive. The smell of hospital gangrene was a staple of frontier infirmaries. Once gangrene set in, the only cure was immediate and brutal amputation. In the absence of professional hospitals and sterile environments, medical care was often a DIY, do-it-yourself affair, or provided by traveling experts, whose qualifications were dubious at best. This created a culture of extreme physical endurance and reliance on dangerous substances. Frontier dentistry. The Chamber of Horrors. As mentioned in the video, dental work, specifically pulling teeth, was done without any form of numbing agent. In the 1870s, there were very few trained dentists in the West. Often, the person who pulled your teeth was the same person who shod your horses, the local blacksmith. The turnkey and the pliers. The tools used were brutal. A dental turnkey was a device that clamped onto a tooth and used leverage to twist it out of the socket. This often resulted in fractured jawbones or the accidental removal of the wrong tooth. Because there was no anesthesia, the patient's head was often held between the knees of the dentist to prevent them from recoiling. Infection and brain abscesses. Even if a tooth was successfully removed, the lack of sterilization meant that the open socket was a direct highway for bacteria to enter the bloodstream. A simple toothache could lead to a systemic infection or a brain abscess, turning a minor dental issue into a fatal event. The false teeth stigma. Because dental health was so poor due to the diet of sugar and hardtack, many people were completely edentulous, toothless, by age 30. Those who could afford it wore primitive dentures made of porcelain or even teeth harvested from the dead, known as Waterloo teeth, which were often uncomfortable and caused further oral sores. The age of opium and alcohol. Chemical cures. Since doctors had no real way to cure diseases, they focused on suppressing symptoms. This led to the widespread use of highly addictive substances as medicine. Whiskey as the universal solvent. Alcohol was the primary anesthetic and antiseptic. Before a painful procedure, a patient was often given half a bottle of whiskey to dull the senses. However, alcohol thins the blood, which often caused the patient to bleed more profusely during surgery, increasing the risk of death from blood loss. The opium scourge. Opium and its derivative, morphine, were sold over the counter at any general store. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was used for everything from toothaches to nervousness in women. It was even given to infants to keep them quiet, often referred to as mother's helper. Thousands of settlers became accidental addicts, leading to a silent epidemic of drug dependency across the frontier. The soothing syrup trap. Many patent medicines contained massive amounts of cocaine or heroin. While these made the patient feel better momentarily by masking the pain, they did nothing to treat the underlying infection, allowing diseases like pneumonia or gangrene to progress until they were terminal. Quackery and the snake oil salesman. The desperation of people in constant pain created a booming market for frauds. Since real doctors were often just as ineffective as quacks, many settlers turned to charismatic traveling salesmen. Electricity and magnetism. Some quacks sold electric belts or magnetic rings that they claimed could cure everything from paralysis to cancer. In a world where real science was still mysterious, these gadgets seemed plausible to desperate miners and farmers. Toxic ingredients. Snake oil wasn't just useless, it was often dangerous. Many tonics contained lead, mercury, or arsenic. Mercury, in particular, was used to treat syphilis, but it often killed the patient through heavy metal poisoning, causing their teeth to fall out and their bones to rot, long before the disease could. The surgeon's toolkit. A frontier doctor's bag was a collection of horrors. It included bone saws with wooden handles, which absorbed blood and bacteria, trephines for drilling into the skull to release pressure, and various lancets for bloodletting. Even in the 1870s, some doctors still believed in balancing the humors by removing blood from a patient who was already weakened by illness. The medical reality of the 1870s was a world where the cure was often as dangerous as the ailment. As the American West became more violent and industrialized, doctors were forced to deal with complex trauma using tools and knowledge that were centuries out of date. The brutal reality of gunshot wounds. While Hollywood depicts cowboys being shot and returning to a gunfight minutes later, the reality was a slow, agonizing process of decay. The lead poisoning of the wound. Bullets in the 1870s were made of soft lead. Upon impact, they would often flatten or shatter, sending shards of metal and, more importantly, scraps of dirty clothing deep into the muscle and bone. The surgeon's finger. Without X-rays, which weren't discovered until 1895, The primary diagnostic tool was the doctor's own finger. A surgeon would stick an unwashed finger into the bullet hole to feel for the lead. This almost guaranteed a massive infection. If the bullet could not be found, it was left inside, leading to chronic lead poisoning or internal abscesses. Abdominal wounds as a death sentence. If a person was shot in the stomach or intestines, medical science had no answer. Peritonitis, infection of the abdominal lining, would set in within 24 hours. The patient would die in excruciating pain from septic shock, as surgeons were terrified to open the abdomen, knowing that doing so almost always resulted in immediate death. Maternal mortality, the angel of death in the home. As touched upon in the first subtitle, the medical treatment of women during childbirth was a primary factor in the low life expectancy of the era. The scourge of puerperal fever. Doctors of the 1870s often moved from treating a patient with gangrene or performing an autopsy directly to a woman in labor. Because they did not wash their hands or change their blood-stained coats, they introduced deadly bacteria into the birth canal. Primitive obstetric tools. If a birth became obstructed, the tools used were terrifying. Forceps were often unsterilized and used with such force that they caused permanent tissue damage to the mother and skull fractures in the infant. The lack of postpartum care, hemorrhaging, excessive bleeding, was the leading cause of death for mothers. Without blood transfusions or effective clotting medicines, a doctor could do little more than watch as a woman bled to death on her own kitchen table. The Listerian Revolution, a slow change of heart. By the late 1870s, the ideas of Joseph Lister regarding antiseptics, using carbolic acid to kill germs, began to trickle into the West, but they were met with extreme resistance. Professional arrogance. Many older frontier doctors felt insulted by the suggestion that their hands were dirty. They took pride in their surgical crust, the layers of dried blood and pus on their operating gowns, viewing it as a sign of experience. The cost of cleanliness. Carbolic acid and specialized surgical soaps were expensive and hard to transport to remote areas. Even if a doctor wanted to be sterile, the dust-filled environment of a sod house or a tent made a clean surgery impossible. The final transition. It wasn't until the very end of the decade that white coat medicine began to appear. The transition from the blood and guts era to the sterile and safe era was written in the graves of the thousands who died during this experimental period of medical history. To survive a medical procedure in the 1870s required a level of physical and mental toughness that is nearly impossible to imagine today. The doctor was a figure of both hope and terror. When we look back at the 35-year life expectancy, we must realize it wasn't just the wildness of the West that killed people. It was the well-intentioned but lethal ignorance of the medical profession itself. In the modern world, travel is a matter of convenience and schedules. In the 1870s Wild West, travel was an act of survival. Moving from one settlement to another meant leaving the fragile bubble of civilization and entering a vast, lawless expanse where your life depended entirely on your own wits, your weapon, and your luck. The void of authority. Why lawlessness prevailed. The term Wild West was not an exaggeration. It described a geographical area where the reach of the law was incredibly thin. In the 1870s, a single U.S. Marshal might be responsible for an area the size of a modern European country. The jurisdiction gap. If a crime was committed on the trail between two towns, there was often no one to report it to. By the time a victim reached a sheriff, the perpetrators had vanished into the mountains or crossed territorial lines. This no man's land became a sanctuary for the desperate and the violent. The high cost of justice. Maintaining a police force or a jail was expensive. Many frontier towns only hired a lawman when things became unbearable, and even then, these lawmen were often former outlaws themselves. The line between a sheriff and a bandit was often just a tin badge that could be removed at any moment. The law of the gun. Because the state could not protect the individual was forced to protect themselves. This led to a culture of open carry, not as a political statement, but as a basic necessity. If you were unarmed on the trail, you were considered a target. The threat of stagecoach and train robberies. For those who could afford it, the stagecoach, or the newly emerging railroad, was the primary mode of travel. However, these veins of commerce were the favorite targets of organized bandit gangs. The stagecoach ambush. Traveling by stagecoach was a miserable experience, cramped, dusty, and jarring. It was also incredibly dangerous. Bandits would wait at dead man's curves or narrow passes where the horses had to slow down. They would shoot the driver or the lead horses, leaving the passengers at their mercy. The Black Bart phenomenon. Outlaws like Charles Bull's Black Bart became legends not for their kindness, but for the frequency with which they terrorized the Wells Fargo lines. Passengers were often stripped of their jewelry, cash, and even their boots, left stranded in the middle of a desert. Train wrecking. As railroads expanded, outlaws found that they could derail a train by loosening the tracks. The resulting crash would kill or injure dozens of people, allowing the gang to loot the express car and the helpless passengers in the chaos. The nature of frontier outlaws. Unlike the noble outlaws seen in cinema, the bandits of the 1870s were often brutal opportunists. Many were former soldiers from the Civil War who had been traumatized by combat and possessed the tactical skills to wage a small-scale war against civilians. But James' younger gang. These were not Robin Hood figures. They were violent insurgents who used the vastness of the West to hide after daring daylight robberies. Their presence meant that no bank or train was ever truly safe, creating a climate of constant fear that stifled economic growth in many regions. The social bandit. In some areas, outlaws were protected by local populations who hated the government or the big railroad companies. This made it impossible for law enforcement to find them, as the very people they were supposed to protect were acting as lookouts for the criminals. In the 1870s, the Wild and Wild West referred to more than just the lack of human law. It referred to a landscape that was actively hostile to human life. Travelers moving across the plains or through the mountain passes faced a gauntlet of biological and meteorological threats that no gun could solve. The terror of apex predators. When a traveler left the outskirts of a town, they effectively moved down the food chain. The frontier was still populated by massive predators that had not yet been pushed to extinction by human expansion. The grizzly bear. In the 1870s, grizzly populations extended much further into the plains than they do today. For a lone traveler on horseback, a surprise encounter with a 1,000-pound grizzly was often fatal. The primitive single-shot rifles or low-caliber revolvers of the time were often insufficient to stop a charging bear, leading to horrific mauling deaths. The gray wolf. While wolves generally avoid humans, the sheer number of packs in the 1870s made them a constant psychological and physical threat. At night, travelers had to keep fire watches to prevent wolves from attacking their horses or oxen. A traveler whose horse was killed or run off by wolves was as good as dead, stranded hundreds of miles from help. Mountain lions and rattlesnakes. The silent killers were just as dangerous. A rattlesnake bite in 1875 was a slow, agonizing way to die. Without antivenom, the only treatment was to cut the wound and pour whiskey on it, an ineffective method that often led to faster infection and death. Environmental killers. The axe of God. The geography of the West was a trap for the unwary. A lack of paved roads, Bridges and weather forecasting meant that nature could turn lethal in a matter of seconds. The flash flood. In the canyons of the Southwest, a rainstorm 10 miles away could send a wall of water 10 feet high, roaring down a dry creek bed. Entire wagon trains were frequently swept away while trying to cross what looked like a shallow stream. The White Death, blizzards. On the Great Plains, a blue norther could drop temperatures by 40 degrees in an hour. Travelers caught in the open had no shelter. Stories of pioneers being found frozen solid just yards away from their own front doors because they became disoriented in the whiteout conditions were tragically common. The desert mirage and dehydration. In the Mojave or the Salt Flats, the primary enemy was the sun. Water holes were often alkali, poisonous, or completely dry. A traveler who lost their way could die of heat stroke and dehydration within 48 hours. The lack of water led to hallucinations, and many were found dead after wandering in circles until their hearts gave out. The physical brutality of the trail. Even without predators or storms, the act of traveling was physically destructive to the human body. The jolting of the wagon. Travelers in covered wagons, schooners, did not actually sit in the wagon. The ride was too rough and would cause internal injuries. Most walked alongside the wagon for 15 to 20 miles a day. This led to pioneer foot, a condition of extreme blistering, infections, and bone stress fractures. The dust pneumonia of the trail. Moving in a caravan meant breathing in the kicked-up dust of hundreds of animals for weeks at a time. This coated the lungs in fine alkaline silt, leading to trail cough and making the travelers highly susceptible to the respiratory diseases discussed in earlier sections. Drowning during river crossings. Rivers like the Missouri or the Platte were wide, deep, and lacked bridges. Wagons had to be caulked with tar to float like boats, or driven across fords. If a wagon tipped or a horse panicked, the weight of the heavy canvas and supplies would drag everyone, men, women, and children, to the bottom. In a land where the government was a distant memory and nature was a constant threat, the concept of justice underwent a radical and often violent transformation. When the law failed to provide safety, the citizens of the 1870s West took the law into their own blood-stained hands. Vigilante justice, the law of the rope. Because the legal system was slow and often corrupt, many communities formed vigilance committees. While these were intended to bring order, they often became instruments of mob rule. The lynch mob. If a horse thief or a murderer was caught, the townspeople rarely waited for a circuit judge to arrive, a process that could take months. Instead, they would hold a kangaroo court and hang the suspect from the nearest sturdy tree or bridge. This was known as the law of the rope. The danger of mistakes. Without a formal trial or evidence, innocent people were frequently executed based on rumors or personal grudges. Once the vigilante fever took hold of a crowd, there was no stopping it. The psychological impact on a town after a lynching was profound, creating a cycle of guilt, fear, and further violence. The hired gun. Many towns and cattle barons hired professional killers, called regulators or detectives, to enforce their version of the law. These men, such as those involved in the Lincoln County War or the Johnson County War, often used terror tactics to protect the interests of their employers, leading to small-scale civil wars. The psychological weight of isolation. The risks of travel were not just physical, they were mental. The vast, empty spaces of the 1870s West could drive a person to the brink of insanity. Prairie madness. This was a documented phenomenon, particularly among women and lone travelers. The constant sound of the wind. the lack of any human contact for weeks, and the perpetual fear of attack led to severe depression and psychosis. The fear of the other, because travelers could not know if the person they met on the trail was a friendly settler or a cold-blooded killer. Every social interaction was a high-stakes standoff. This led to a culture of extreme suspicion and shoot-first mentalities, which only increased the overall lawlessness of the region. The closing of the frontier, the railroad and the telegraph. The end of the 1870s marked the beginning of the end for the Wild West. Two major technological forces began to tame the lawlessness and reduce the risks of travel. The Transcontinental Railroad. As the iron rails connected the east to the west, the 6-month journey in a covered wagon was replaced by a 6-day journey in a train car. While train robberies still occurred, the railroad brought with it the railway police and a steady stream of settlers, making the wilderness less empty and therefore less dangerous. The singing wire, the telegraph. For the first time, information could travel faster than a horse. If a gang robbed a bank in one town, the next town could be alerted instantly. This made it much harder for outlaws to disappear and allowed U.S. Marshals to coordinate their efforts across vast distances. The arrival of bureaucracy. By the late 1870s, territories were becoming states. With statehood came formal courts, permanent jails, and professionalized law enforcement. The law of the gun slowly gave way to the law of the book. Final conclusion: the reality behind the legend. The 1870s American West was a place of extreme paradox. It offered the ultimate freedom, but it demanded a price that most modern people could not pay. As the video illustrates, life was a relentless struggle against filth, back-breaking labor, malnutrition, primitive medicine, and the ever-present threat of violence. When we see the Wild West in movies, we see a land of adventure. But the reality was a world where you didn't wash for months. Your teeth rotted out of your head. You worked 14 hours a day until your heart stopped at age 35. And a single rainy day on the trail could result in your death. The taming of the West was not just about building cities. It was about the human race slowly gaining the upper hand over an environment that tried to kill them every single day.